My name is George Kstodrytis, and I'm Associate Professor of Architecture at the American University of Sharjah. Under the title Performative Urbanism in the Gulf, I will share with you some of the positions and my own research relating to the struggle of the emerging Gulf city. The focus here will be on the UAE on one hand, and on the other, the approach to an architecture education in the Gulf. On one hand, the Gulf city, I think, has been developed in a very problematic way. The struggle between tradition and modernity, the struggle between Orientalism and Westernization, also is part of this research that I will share with you now. And I will move on then to show some of the work, some experimental architecture student work that I do at the American University of Sharjah, where we're trying to maybe for the first time look at different ways, different approaches to the creation and the development and the intensification of the Gulf city, looking more closely and relating design to issues of material behavior, contemporary digital processes, also environmental, climatic, infrastructure influences, as well as making the students think about the social and also the politics of space as opposed to a space of pure production. And one of the dilemma possibly starts with this image, an image of late 1970s in Abu Dhabi. It's a beautiful setting by the coast, the beauty of the desert, but also the beginning of the, if you like, the infiltration of modernity, highways, infrastructures, and so on, anticipating the arrival of a large immigrant and expatriate population. Oscar Niemeyer project for Alulu Island, 1981 in Abu Dhabi was quite interesting. I'm going to talk a little bit about modernity in the Gulf here. It's a pure centralized sketch of a space for a conference center in this leisure island. It's interesting to see the notion of modernity and the free form creation of spaces versus the flatness of the landscape. But despite the attempts of some interesting modernist architecture in the region, one cannot escape the reality. This sporadic, non-planned placement of projects. Every property is within itself. There's no sense of cohesion. There's no sense of space. There's no relationship, and so on. And this might be one extreme example of suburban housing in the UAE, but I think it's a symptom that has been quite adopted, I think, throughout the Gulf landscape. Even further, this is a photograph I took from a helicopter over Dubai's Palm Island. On one hand, it's a very beautiful architecture. On the other hand, it's really something that cannot be discussed or we cannot be critical architecturally speaking. There's no space in between the buildings. There's no sense of continuity. It's a series of Western icons placed on an artificial island. And even more, when one begins to see in more detail the structure of this layout, it's more a kind of series of making architecture by numbers as opposed to being critical about either tradition or modernity. The history of, in this case, Dubai, the master planning evolution of Dubai, I think is quite fascinating. 1959, the first master plan of Dubai, done by a British architect, John Harris, invited by Sheikh Rashid at the time, slightly before the discovery of oil in the UAE. It's a fascinating, I think, plan. in terms of urban planning and design, in the sense that John Harris at the time was not really interested to introduce zoning and a kind of gradual expansion of the urban fabric, but instead he took the old part of the city around the creek, the Pastakia area, and then he superimposed a series of networks of highways anticipating the fast expansion of the city. And in a way, rightly or wrongly, one can say that the current urban condition of Dubai is really a result of this. That is a highway city based on streets as opposed to neighborhoods. Even though at the time John Harris has some interesting ideas of incorporating this grid of roads starting from the old part of the city, not really demolishing the old part, but using some of the directions and patterns of the streets to expand out onto the desert. At the same time, this is 1974, architect Makhlouf it's interesting here pointing at the master plan of Abu Dhabi to Sheikh Zayed, which I find these engagements of the architect planner and the ruler really fascinating. The ruler is really watching the architect carefully, pointing at the future master plan of Abu Dhabi. Another modernist introduction, if you like, into the emerging city of Abu Dhabi at the time. Similarly, I think it's pretty much the same time. This must be 1974. Sheikh Rashid on the left, John Harris, the architect of the master plan of Dubai of 1959, and some advisors of the ruler drinking coffee and smoking and pointing at a sectional drawing, which was to become the tallest building in the Middle East in 1978. That's the World Trade Center. Another amazing moment, I think, where modern ideas begin to infiltrate the city. The ruler directly discussing the project with the architect. And 4 years later, 1974, the building became a reality, or surreality maybe, because this building was a beautifully detailed concrete prefabricated facade, but placed almost in the middle of nowhere, away from the center of Dubai, pointing towards the west and pointing towards Abu Dhabi. It was basically the beginning of Sheikh Zayed Road. And the notion of modernity, on one hand, with, of course, notions of westernization were very obvious. This is the model of the project, 1974. It was a Hilton hotel, an expo center, and a World Trade Center planted outside the city of Dubai. And even more, I think, surreal in certain ways, the opening of the building, 1978, Sheikh Rashid on the left, John Harris on the right, but also Queen Elizabeth, Queen of England, opening the building in 1974. Not much to see outside because it was still in the middle of the desert. 1970s, the expansion, or rather the first main building in Dubai, I think a beautiful building, the Terminal 1 of the airport, Terminal 1. Some beautiful interiors, which you can still find some of these interiors. Looks more like a setting of a James Bond movie in the 70s rather than an airport in the Middle East, which I think is really, it's a beautiful setting. The vision of the rulers to anticipate a series of cities which were to become extremely popular among Western tourists in the 80s and 90s. But despite that, the struggle with finding an identity, what one might call reconstructed Orientalists, Edward Said's also definition of Orientalism as an oversimplification of the notion of what the Middle East became also quite popular, especially among developers and tourists in the Gulf cities. This is an interesting collage. Medina Jumeirah framed within an Orientalist painting, something which will have a great appeal, I think, for the Western tourists searching for a form of identity of the Middle East. And at the time, an interesting photograph, which is the back of a billboard that I took in some distance outside Dubai, large projects which were meant to be built. They were never built, but instead there were a series of large billboards anticipating the scale of the project. So within this context, I now shift to to show some of the work at the American University of Sharjah that I do in my studio. Instead of dealing with the bigger picture and the iconic, we turn our attention to the back streets of the city, where the buildings are evidently not very interesting, but the street condition and the urban mapping and the invisible urban systems, as one might call, become incredibly interesting. That really is where the Arab city operates, in the bazaars and in the backs of the streets and in the pattern of street behavior. And rather than just going straight into a kind of formal language, which is expected in a way in a school of architecture to come up with a series of solutions, I took my students in the back streets and encouraged them to look at the invisible systems and ways that the city is created prior to the making of a constructed building. And one of the students here began to look at the way some of the Iranian trading people are dealing in Deira, and he discovered this incredibly intelligent system of gatherings and densities and creating these topographical almost drawings of behavior. Another student, actually both the students are Farid and Ahmed. They are the directors of Ex-Architects, one of the most interesting, I think, emerging young local practice in the UAE. This is Ahmed's project then, where he discovered this thermal photography camera from the engineering department of our university. And he started recording the era in the downtown, not through buildings, but through temperature. And it became extremely interesting because here is a local a young architect who began to see his own city through a different lens, if you like. And he began to identify areas of moments of intensity in the city, areas of gatherings, the red spots in the city, and so on. Another project here in these formative years, I was teaching at the at the American University of Sharjah about 10 years ago. One student here was looking at Wi-Fi systems in the city, so he discovered this GPS equipment and a sensor that can register Wi-Fi signals, which sounds a little bit strange, but somehow he managed to identify the locations of Wi-Fi stations in the city, something now that every city is adopting this Wi-Fi for everybody. But we discovered that in terms of technology, the Gulf cities, it's extremely advanced. So he began to look at the informal spaces, the kind of digital space of the signal, if you like, and try to translate that into a series of abstract architectural notations, beginning to generate, let's say, a program of the open office. 2 minutes? Yes. Another project here, later on, about 6 years ago, looking at abandoned projects in Dubai. Again here, the notion of looking at architecture as not as a product, but as a process of the economy of the city, and beginning to do some collages and inserting new programs on what is meant to be the commercial towers of the city, which were then abandoned, a series of new programmatic conditions such as small theater and gathering spaces. So also the issue of the master plan is quite interesting. This is, I just put here, it's an interesting project by Kenzo Tang, 1974, for the Haji pilgrimage housing, a series of permanent and temporary units, again anticipating the large influx of people for the pilgrimage. Over the last 3-4 years, and even recently with Noura Akawi also, and my colleague Kevin Mitchell, we were looking at as one way of incorporating in our discussions the politics and the social condition of the space. We started visiting refugee camps in Jordan. This is the Zaatari camp that was long before it was fully expanded, and also Al-Jerash Palestinian camp in Amman. And we found these spaces which are suspended into time, almost the impossible space of intervention, quite fascinating to deal with. And the notion of the refugee and displacement, it was something that we use in the projects. A student here dealing more with the ecological and climatic condition, using some of the robots we have at the university. She started drawing and constructing a series of three-dimensional structural components that were meant, and they became three-dimensional spaces by spraying a series of adhesives using the robot on the sun, and in this case creating a dome-like space as a temporary settlement in the desert. And also the notion of the post-nomadic notion of movement and interactivity. This is a floating space off the coast of Dubai. And also dealing with issues of the landscape, a series of spaces that will begin to relate more to the landscape, possibly than more to a programmatic condition. And I'm now going through quickly, and I'm finishing now, or very soon. Looking at this is an infrastructure project, very much inspired by the huge and at part invisible infrastructures in the Gulf City. A student here was looking at systems of interactivity, ways of constructing small or extremely large spaces as one way of generating a series of formless business hubs near inside Port Rashid in the UAE. Thank you.